Hello YouTube family, if you're tuning in tonight, chances are you're here for another haunting tale to drift off to. Before we dive in, tell me, where are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? Drop your location in the comments below, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Crime Whispers. Now, let's get into tonight's chilling case. Case 1, Emily Wilson, the Queen of Summer, 2014. The sun-drenched streets of Los Angeles buzzed with Life Street performers, honking horns, dreams colliding with harsh realities. But beneath the golden haze and Hollywood glitter, a storm was quietly building, one that would expose a dark corner of the city's soul. This is the story of Emily Wilson, a woman whose ambition, charm, and greed would carve her name into California's criminal history. Emily wasn't what you'd expect. On the surface, she looked like any other young professional, late 20s. Long brown hair, a captivating smile, and eyes that shimmered with drive and something else. Something darker, hidden beneath layers of designer clothing and flawless makeup. Emily was leading a double life. She wasn't desperate. She wasn't poor. Emily came from a stable, middle-class home in the quiet suburbs outside LA. She was raised to believe she could achieve anything, and she believed it. But unlike others who fought for success, Emily craved shortcuts. She didn't want to climb the ladder, she wanted to skip it entirely. That hunger for more led her into the shadows of the city, where she crossed paths with a sophisticated criminal, ring people who thrived on laundering money, forging documents, and running elaborate scams. To Emily, it wasn't crime. It was power. It was control. By 2014, Emily had shed her old life completely. She wasn't just playing the part anymore. She was leading it. She moved effortlessly among LA's elite, attending exclusive parties, rubbing shoulders with CEOs and celebrities, all while running a high-stakes credit card fraud empire behind the scenes. She had all access to confidential data, ties to corrupt insiders, and millions flowing through her hands. But with power came obsession. Emily wasn't satisfied with success. She wanted control over everything and everyone. Her most lucrative scheme involved hacking into major bank systems. She and her team harvested personal data, created fake identities, and secured credit cards in dozens of false names. They'd max out the cards, vanish, and leave the banks scrambling. The FBI was left chasing ghosts. For months, they had no trail. Emily was meticulous, covering every track, erasing every trace. But power makes people sloppy. Emily grew arrogant, reckless even. She expanded her operation, laundering money through casinos and luxury car dealerships, believing she was untouchable. Then came the crack in the foundation. Alex, a skilled hacker, and once a trusted partner in the scheme, began to unravel. The guilt, the paranoia, it got to him. He slipped up, just once. An encrypted email sent from a burner phone was all it took. Authorities pounced. For months, the FBI had been quietly tracing the money. Now, they had a name, a location, a target. Emily's empire began to crumble. Agents raided her upscale apartment. Hidden safes, forged documents, offshore accounts laid bare. Her life of luxury was over in a flash. No more designer clothes, no more power, no more shadows to hide in. As she sat in the back of a police cruiser, the city lights flickering. Outside, Emily stared silently out the window. Los Angeles, the city she once ruled in secret, was now watching her fall. Her arrest marked just the beginning. The investigation unraveled a vast criminal network, and Emily's trial became national news. The courtroom saw a parade of victims, former allies, and law enforcement, all exposing the tangled web she had spun. And yet, Emily remained composed, even defiant. She believed she was smarter than the system, but the evidence told another story. In the end, Emily Wilson's fall wasn't sudden. It was slow, calculated, inevitable. She wasn't a victim. She was a mastermind, one whose ambition turned into obsession. whose hunger for control consumed everything. And while the court sentenced her to decades behind bars, the mark she left on California's criminal landscape lingers, like a ghost in the city's glittering streets. Greed has a way of unraveling everything, and, in Emily Wilson's case, it unraveled her entire empire with each passing day in court. More disturbing details surfaced, revealing the true depth of her criminal activity. Prosecutors laid out their case meticulously. To them, Emily wasn't a victim. She was a puppet master, a manipulator, a woman whose charm masked something far more sinister. Meanwhile, her defense team scrambled to rewrite the narrative. They painted her as someone swept up by forces beyond her control, an ambitious woman who got in over her head. They argued she was pressured, even coerced, by the powerful men she worked with, that she was just a pawn. But the evidence told a different story, a story far too dark to ignore. Thousands of fraudulent transactions, dozens of stolen identities, a paper trail of offshore accounts, and laundered millions, all of it traced back to Emily. Then came the testimony of Alex, her former right-hand man in the credit card fraud scheme. He had turned state's witness in exchange for a reduced sentence. His words were clinical, emotionless, devastating. He described how Emily masterminded every step, how she directed, manipulated, and orchestrated the entire operation with chilling precision. Emily showed no remorse, he said. Not once. The most damning blow came from wiretapped conversations between Emily and one of her closest associates, a man named Christopher Reynolds, another key player in the laundering side of the scheme. In one of the recordings, Emily's voice rang out, cold and proud. "We're untouchable, Chris. We've got them all wrapped around our little fingers. They'll never catch us." It was arrogance in its purest form. She hadn't just broken the law, she had mocked it. The defense kept pushing their narrative of coercion and victimhood, but it wasn't enough. The jury listened. They watched. And with every new revelation, the image of Emily Wilson, clever businesswoman, shattered further. What remained was something far darker. The media, of course, devoured every moment. Emily's face was plastered across newspapers and screens. How did a woman so seemingly ordinary, so polished, so poised to become the architect of one of California's most elaborate financial frauds? Journalists dug into her past, unearthing early signs of deception. Her suburban upbringing had once looked picture perfect, but now it read like a warning. Raised in a world where success was paramount, Emily had learned to value status over substance, manipulation over honesty. She was taught to win, and she didn't care who she had to step on to get there. Over time, her thirst for power deepened. What began as minor scams and forged documents evolved into a sprawling web of crime that spanned multiple states and victimized hundreds. By the time closing arguments arrived, the prosecution didn't hold back. They portrayed Emily as a predator who used her beauty, intelligence, and charm to exploit, deceive, and destroy. She wasn't lost. She wasn't coerced. She was calculated. And then it was Emily's turn. The woman who had once strutted into court with calm confidence now sat quietly, head lowered. When she took the stand, her voice was low, nearly trembling. She apologized, said she had made mistakes, that she was no longer the person who committed those crimes. She asked for forgiveness, for mercy. But the jury had already seen behind the curtain. They had heard the recordings, seen the paper trail, and listened to those she had betrayed. Her final words felt scripted, an echo of the woman who once believed she could talk her way out of anything. It wasn't enough. After a short deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict, guilty on all counts. Fraud, money laundering, identity, theft, conspiracy. As the verdict was read, Emily showed no emotion, but the silence that followed was deafening. Weeks later, victims packed the courtroom for her sentencing. People whose lives had been wrecked by her lies, whose savings had vanished, whose trust in the system had been broken. The judge didn't hold back. He sentenced Emily Wilson to 25 years in federal prison. No possibility of parole. The maximum allowed by law. The once untouchable queen of high society was now just another inmate stripped of her power, her luxury, her lies. Reflection. Moody, thoughtful tone as she was led out of the courtroom in cuffs. Emily held her head high, but the mask had long since cracked. Her story, a tale of brilliance, poisoned by greed, was now a cautionary legend. The city that had once embraced her now whispered her name with disdain. And prison life. It was nothing like the world she once ruled. Gone were the luxury apartments, the designer clothes, the influential allies. Now, Emily woke each morning to cement walls and silence. No control, no power, just time. Time to reflect on everything she had built and everything she had destroyed. Her name, once uttered at cocktail parties and business meetings, now served as a warning that no matter how clever you are, how charming or untouchable you may seem, the truth always finds a way to break through. And in the end, Emily Wilson wasn't just caught, she was completely undone by her own ambition. Prison didn't just take away Emily Wilson's freedom. It stripped her of everything, her identity, her status, even her sense of self. She was no longer Emily Wilson, the poised socialite, once adored in Los Angeles high society. Now, she was simply inmate number 927,541, confined behind the cold, unforgiving walls of a federal penitentiary. The transition was brutal. The glamour of her past life, the lavish parties, the designer clothes, the sleek cars was replaced by the echo of metal doors and the rigid rhythm of institutional life. Gone was the world she had manipulated to her will. In its place stood a harsh reality governed by routine, discipline, and survival. For someone who had built her entire existence around charm and influence, prison was the ultimate punishment. There was no one left to impress, no one to persuade, no masks to hide behind. She was assigned to a medium security facility in Northern California, and while her name was known, it wasn't for reasons she was proud of. Other inmates whispered her story, some intrigued, others resentful. But regardless of curiosity, Emily had no special privileges. In here, she was just another number. In the beginning, she tried to maintain control in the only way she knew, how, through appearance. She kept her uniform crisp, tried to carry herself with the same dignity she once wore like a crown. But deep down, she knew the woman she had once been was slipping away. Gone were the glimmering nights of LA. Her past life now felt like a mirage, intangible and fading. Still, Emily was nothing if not resilient. Even within the unforgiving walls of prison, she began navigating her new world the same way she had before, by reading people, forming quiet alliances, and identifying those who could offer her protection or influence. But survival behind bars wasn't about money or status. It was about loyalty, about trust, and above all, about adapting. Her sharp mind, once used to build a criminal empire, became her greatest tool again. She applied it not to manipulate, but to endure. She took on the tasks assigned to her: scrubbing floors, serving meals in the cafeteria, folding uniforms. But every chore chipped away at the illusion she'd once clung to. The truth settled in her bones. She had fallen, and it was all her doing. With time, something began to change. Emily started confronting her past, the faces of her victims, the lives she had shattered, the trust she had broken. These weren't abstract anymore. They haunted her. In the silence of her cell, the guilt became unbearable. For the first time, she stopped blaming others, stopped pretending. She began writing letters, apologies to those she had wronged. They weren't part of any legal strategy. They wouldn't change her sentence, but they were real, honest, painful, a quiet attempt at redemption. Her actions couldn't be undone, but maybe, just maybe, some part of her could be rebuilt. In time, she earned a sliver of respect inside the prison. She never fully regained trust, but the other inmates began to see her differently. Not as the glamorous fraudster who once made headlines, but as someone trying to face the wreckage of her choices. She volunteered for educational programs, taught business basics to women preparing for life after prison. She worked with counselors, finally exploring the deep-rooted hunger for validation and power that had driven her to destroy so many lives. But the stain of her past was permanent. Her name remained tied to one of the largest fraud schemes in California's history. The media continued to follow her even from behind bars. To the public, Emily Wilson had become a symbol, a reminder of how easily ambition can curdle into destruction. Her story was no longer one of success. It was a cautionary tale. A woman who once had everything only to lose it all, chasing more. Her rise was swift, her fall absolute. Pause, transition to new case, but Emily's wasn't the only story of ambition turned deadly. Case 2. Wichita, Kansas, 2012. A small, quiet town. The kind of place where people left their doors unlocked, and everyone knew each other by name. But beneath the calm surface, one man's dark ambition was about to ignite a case that would rattle the entire state. His name was Michael Carter, and while he wasn't brilliant or powerful by birth, he was driven by envy, by resentment, and a craving for control that would push him beyond the limits of morality. Case 2 begins unsettling, curious tone. Michael Carter was born and raised in Wichita. His childhood was unremarkable, but shaped by struggle. His father worked long hours as a mechanic. His mother juggled nursing shifts just to keep food on the table. There was love in the Carter household, but also tension, stress, a constant shadow of financial instability. Michael was the youngest of 3, and from a young age, he noticed the difference between what his family had and what others had. While his classmates wore brand-name shoes and showed off the latest gadgets, Michael watched from the sidelines. He wasn't bitter at first, but envy has a way of rooting itself deep. To Michael, money didn't just mean comfort. It meant freedom. It meant power. It meant being seen, being respected, being in control. As he reached adulthood, that quiet hunger began to turn dangerous. At first, it was petty crime, gambling, minor theft, nothing major. But Michael's ambitions outgrew his means, and soon, he found himself among people who fed that desire, people who promised quick cash, easy scams, and no consequences. What started as small-time hustling would soon spiral into a case so twisted, so calculated, it would leave the community of Wichita in shock. Michael Carter always carried a sense that he was meant for more than what life had given him. But that feeling didn't come from hope. It came from the weight of inadequacy, a gnawing belief that somewhere, out there, a bigger life was waiting, if only he had the guts to take it. By 2010, that need for something greater had led Michael down a dark path. No longer just scraping by, he was now deep in the world of organized crime. He'd linked up with a local gang that had its hands in everything: drugs, weapons, identity scams, and Michael. He was a natural, smart, strategic, and ruthlessly efficient. He didn't just follow orders, he thrived in chaos, rising through the ranks with ease. But no matter how high he climbed, Michael never truly felt safe. He was haunted by the fear of losing it all, of watching the empire he was building crumble beneath him. Then, in early 2012, an opportunity came knocking, a job that promised to change everything, a bank robbery. Not just any robbery, this was big, millions in cash, minimal security. A target that looked, to them, like a guaranteed score. It was all thanks to a well-connected associate who had inside info on a small regional bank known for loose protocols and a vault full of cash. The plan was airtight, the risks calculated. Michael, always the opportunist, saw it as his way out. No more running, no more fear. Just one job, and his future would finally be secured. The date was set, a rainy Thursday afternoon in March. The gang had everything ready: disguises, weapons, insider blueprints. They knew the layout, the guard rotations, the slow hours. Michael's job, command. He would oversee the operation, ensuring every detail unfolded like clockwork. And at first, it did. The team entered the bank disguised as everyday customers. They blended in perfectly. No alarms, no suspicion. Tom, the gang's leader, made the first move, leading to others toward the vault. Michael stationed himself near the front entrance, watching everything, ready to shut it down if anyone tried to bolt. But the silence didn't last. One crew member slipped up. What they hadn't counted on was the silent alarm. It had been tripped. Just moments after the robbery began, police were already en route, and within minutes, the entire operation unraveled. Sirens howled in the distance. The calm inside the bank was instantly shattered. Customers screamed, crew members panicked, and Michael. He felt his dream, his escape slipping through his fingers. He had planned for everything except this. In a flash, survival instincts kicked in. Michael made the call. He ran, left the crew, left the money, fled into the rainy Wichita streets, and disappeared into the shadows. Tom and the others were arrested minutes later, but Michael Carter had vanished. Transition, darker tone, the manhunt began immediately. Law enforcement knew they weren't chasing just another thug. Michael was smart, calculating, dangerous. He knew how to disappear, and he did. For 6 long months, he stayed one step ahead, jumping from city to city, changing his look, using aliases, living off the grid. He found refuge in a rundown Kansas City motel, working as a handyman under a fake name, just trying to stay invisible. But, in the end, the past always catches up. A local tip, just a whisper to the right person, led the police straight to his door. The arrest was quick. No shootout, no last stand. Just Michael, silent, resigned, as the walls finally closed in. Courtroom and sentencing reflective tone. The trial was a media storm. People were fascinated by the scale of the robbery, the months on the run, the fall from power. Michael's lawyers painted him as a desperate man, chasing a better life. The prosecution called him what he was, a manipulator, fueled by greed and blind ambition. In the end, the verdict was clear: guilty on all counts. Armed robbery, conspiracy, fleeing law enforcement. Michael Carter was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. Conclusion: slow, solemn tone. His name, once whispered with a kind of underworld respect, became a cautionary tale. He had dreamed of power, of freedom, of rising above the life he was born into. But instead, he became a fugitive, a criminal, and a warning for anyone who thinks they can outsmart the system. Michael Carter had believed he was destined for greatness, but in chasing that dream the wrong way, he became the architect of his own downfall. Now, he watches the world through bars, haunted, not just by the crime, but by what could have been. There was always a part of Michael that believed he was destined for more than the life he was born into, more than the paycheck-to-paycheck grind. He believed he could outsmart the system, take what he was never given, and finally earn the wealth and respect he'd craved for so long. But after his arrest, sitting alone in a holding cell, that fantasy crumbled. The reality was colder than the steel bench beneath him. The adrenaline was gone. The chase was over, and all that remained was the weight of his choices. Michael Carter, once a man constantly in motion, was now still, trapped, and for the first time, forced to confront the full scope of what he'd done. His world had stopped. The long days in jail bled into one another, heavy with silence and monotony. And yet, in a strange way, there was a sense of relief. The fear of being hunted, the paranoia that had followed him for months, it was over now. He could breathe, even if those breaths were taken behind bars. Segment trial of a symbol, courtroom narrative tone. Michael's trial became a media spectacle. To some, he was a ruthless criminal, a calculated thief, who had endangered lives for money. But to others, he was a product of a system that had failed him. A man raised in poverty, denied opportunity, backed into a corner by circumstance. His defense attorneys leaned into that narrative. They painted a picture of a young man born into struggle, a son of overworked parents who barely made ends meet, a boy who watched his world collapse around him before he ever had a chance to build his own. The robbery, they argued, wasn't just a crime. It was a cry for help, but the prosecution didn't buy it. They laid out a very different story, one of choice, of escalation, of a man who didn't stumble into crime, but ran toward it with open arms. They presented his history, ties, a growing rap sheet, a pattern of manipulation. They claimed Michael wasn't a desperate man trying to survive. He was a hardened criminal who wanted more and didn't care who he hurt to get it. Segment, guilty, verdict, and fallout tone. When the verdict came, Michael didn't flinch. He knew what was coming. The evidence was overwhelming. The failed robbery, the flight, the betrayal of his crew. He didn't just commit a crime, he tried to run from it, and in doing so, he sealed his fate. The judge sentenced him to 25 years in federal prison, a number that would now define him. As the cuffs were tightened, Michael didn't feel clever. He didn't feel powerful. He felt empty. The life he had dreamed of, the fast cars, the luxury, the control was gone. What remained was concrete, steel, and a future he could no longer shape. Segment inside prison reflection tone. Life behind bars was a different kind of punishment. It wasn't just the routines or the surveillance. It was the silence, the stillness. Michael, once a man of constant movement and schemes, was now forced to sit with himself. And what he found there wasn't easy to face. At first, he tried to maintain the tough persona, kept quiet, stayed out of trouble, but slowly, the weight of guilt started to press down. He began thinking about the people he hurt, the family he disappointed, and the dream that had never really been real. What haunted him most wasn't losing his freedom. It was realizing he had traded his soul for a fantasy. Over time, something began to shift. Michael enrolled in rehabilitation programs, management, education, vocational training. He started writing letters he'd never send. He listened more, talked less, and for the first time, he stopped trying to outsmart the system and started trying to understand himself. Segment: a changed man. 10 years later, by his 10th year in prison, Michael Carter was no longer the man who had walked into that bank. The ambition was still there, but now it wasn't about money or status. It was about redemption. He knew he couldn't undo the harm he'd caused. He knew some people would never forgive him. But he also knew he had a choice to keep spiraling into regret or to rebuild something from the ruins. And yet, no matter how much he changed, his name remained a reminder of who he used to be to the world. Michael Carter would always be the man behind the heist, a cautionary tale, a symbol of what happens when desperation turns into destruction. Outro: soft, cinematic tone. Redemption is a long road, and not everyone gets to walk it. Michael Carter still wakes up every day behind bars, not just the ones made of steel, but the ones built from his own decisions. He once believed he could cheat fate, that he was too smart to fall. But in the end, he learned the hardest truth of all: you can't outrun consequences, only delay them. The failed heist. It was the moment that made Michael Carter infamous, but not in the way he had once dreamed. His story became one of ambition, colliding with reality, of big plans swallowed by even bigger consequences. Now, behind prison walls, Michael Carter's life was no longer about money or power. It had become a life of quiet reflection and hard-earned lessons. He hadn't been given a second chance at freedom, but he had been given something else, a second chance at redemption. Slow montage: prison life, quiet scenes as the years passed. The chaos that once defined his world faded into a long, slow march. A routine he began to understand, even respect. He wasn't content, far from it. but he had learned to find meaning in the smallest moments. A passing word from a fellow inmate, an hour of reading in his cell, the fleeting stillness during a morning run in the prison yard. Transformation didn't happen all at once. There were days when the weight of regret felt unbearable, when he could barely breathe under the pressure of his own choices. The robbery, the panic, the people he had hurt, faces he'd never be able to forget. But even in those suffocating moments, there was something inside him that whispered, keep going, keep moving forward. Cut to classroom inside prison. Narrator softens. One of the turning points came when he enrolled in the prison's restorative justice program. At first, it was just a formality, another box to tick, another line on the parole application. But something changed. The more he listened, the more he really listened to. The stories shared by others, stories of pain, of loss, of repair. He began to see his crime through new eyes. Restorative justice wasn't about serving time. It was about healing wounds. It was about understanding that crime doesn't just break laws, it breaks lives. And those lives, he realized, weren't faceless, they were real. Cut to victim impact session. Ambient audio fades low. The most difficult part of the program came during the victim impact statements. Here inmates had to sit and listen as survivors, some even tied directly to their own crimes, described the damage that had been done. Michael had never truly faced that before. Not like this. He had been so focused on escaping his own life, on chasing money and control, that he had never thought about the people on the other side of the vault door. Now, he was hearing them. The families who lost loved ones. The children left behind. The trauma that echoed years after the robbery was over. Each word chipped away at the walls he'd built inside himself. And in their place, a new kind of awareness began to grow. With it came a question he couldn't ignore. How do I make this right? Cut to group therapy. Voice trembling slightly one day. During a group session, Michael finally stood up and spoke. Until then, he had kept his head down, his thoughts buried. But now, it was too heavy to carry in silence. Every day, I live with the consequences of what I did, he said, his voice raw, cracking. I didn't just hurt people when I robbed that bank. I hurt my family, I hurt my friends, and I hurt myself. I thought money would set me free, but there's no freedom when you leave destruction behind. For the first time, the room was silent, not out of judgment, but respect. Because in that moment, Michael wasn't just facing his past, he was choosing a different future. Transition. Hopeful music swelled over the following months. His commitment deepened. He began volunteering in the prison's counseling center, helping other inmates confront their own guilt, shame, and anger. He mentored the younger ones, told them the truth about where his choices had led, not with pride, but with honesty. He wasn't trying to erase the past. He was learning to live with it, to use it. Redemption, he came to understand, wasn't about erasing what had happened. It was about owning it and doing everything in his power to become something better. Cut to 15 years later, older, quieter Michael. 15 years into his sentence, Michael Carter had changed. He was no longer the man who had once stormed into a bank chasing illusions of power. He was thoughtful, patient, humbled, and though the path ahead remained uncertain for the first time in his life, he felt ready to walk it with intention. Parole hearing scene slow fade in. When the day came for his parole hearing, Michael was nervous. But he stood before the board, not as a man begging for freedom, but as one who had earned the right to be heard. He laid it all out. The programs, the therapy, the volunteering, the pain, the growth. He wasn't just seeking release. He was seeking a second life, one he could live with integrity. The parole board listened, measured him not just by the severity of his crime, but by the depth of his change. And when they rendered their decision, Michael Carter was granted parole. Final montage, voice soft, steady. He walked out of that prison a different man, not because his past had vanished, but because he had finally learned what it meant to face it. And while the road ahead would still be long, he was ready to walk it. Not for glory, not for wealth, but for something far more rare: redemption. Case 3. Rick Holloway, the man who lost control in 2012. The quiet town of Bloomington, Indiana, found itself at the heart of a deeply personal and devastating story. A story about isolation, addiction, and the kind of emotional unraveling that can happen when pain festers unchecked. This is the story of Richard. Rick Holloway. Rick was 45 years old when his life took a dark turn. He'd never been a violent man, not by nature. He wasn't someone people feared. If anything, most barely noticed him. But like so many others who had grown up in instability, Rick had spent decades circling the margins of society, always drifting, never grounded. His early years weren't easy. Rick grew up in a home ruled by dysfunction. His father, an alcoholic, would vanish for days in a haze of booze. His mother, though kind and hard-working, was left to pick up the pieces. She loved Rick deeply and tried to keep the family together, but the shadow cast by his father's unpredictable behavior was long and heavy. Rick learned young that the world wasn't always safe or fair, and sometimes you had to fend for yourself. By his early 20s, Rick had dropped out of high school. He bounced from job to job: manual labor, warehouse shifts, a short-lived stint as a diner cook. Nothing stuck. His relationship with his father was virtually non-existent, and when his mother died suddenly of a heart attack when he was just 24, Rick unraveled. Her death left a hole in him. For years afterward, he drifted through life like a man sleepwalking. No direction, no purpose. And slowly, the alcohol that had haunted his childhood became his own companion. By 2012, Rick was living in a shabby apartment on the outskirts of Bloomington, quiet, forgotten, and tucked away from the parts of town where life felt full. He was working as a janitor at a local motel. The pay was low, but it covered his basics: rent, food, and booze. Rick's world was small. His social circle was limited to a few drinking buddies at a neighborhood bar. He was known as a quiet guy, kept to himself, didn't cause trouble. But inside, he was barely holding it together. Each drink numbed the ache a little more. Each night passed in a fog. And still, beneath it all, a part of him held on to a fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, things could change. That flicker of hope grew when he met Lisa. Lisa was unlike anyone Rick had ever known. In her late 30s, she was gentle, soft-spoken, and carried herself with a quiet strength. She worked as a secretary at a local law office and had struggles of her own. But there was something about hers, something steady, calm, warm. They met by chance at a bar. At first, their conversations were brief and awkward, but over time, something clicked. Lisa would stop by the bar now and then, and they'd talk for hours. For the first time in years, Rick felt seen. Lisa never judged him. She listened, she smiled, and she gave him something he hadn't felt in a long time: comfort. She was divorced, living alone, and still held on to the belief that life could get better. Rick began to care for her deeply, and that scared him. Their relationship was far from perfect. Some days were filled with laughter and connection. Others were broken by Rick's drinking and emotional withdrawal. Lisa tried to be patient, but Rick was drowning in his addiction. Whenever he spiraled, he would shut her out, ashamed, angry, and afraid of losing the one good thing in his life. By late summer, things had grown tense. Rick was drinking more. Lisa, trying to move forward with her life, had started pulling away. She still cared, but she couldn't carry him forever. And Rick, he noticed, he grew jealous of her independence, of the way she could exist without him, live without needing him. That realization shook him to his core. Then came the night everything changed. It was a humid evening in August. Rick had been drinking all day. He met Lisa for dinner at a local diner. From the moment they sat down, something felt off. Lisa tried to talk, to keep things light, but Rick was elsewhere, lost in his thoughts, emotions swirling. Then Lisa said something that shattered him. She was thinking about moving to Indianapolis. A new job offer, a fresh start, a way out. And in that moment, Rick broke. His heart dropped. Panic took over. The idea of losing her, the only person who seemed to care, was too much. He didn't have the words to express the fear, the desperation. So instead, it came out as rage. What happened next was blurred by alcohol and emotion. Rick lashed out. He grabbed Lisa's arm, shouting, trying to stop her from leaving. She pushed him away, and then he shoved her. She fell, hard, in the middle of that diner, with strangers watching. It wasn't planned. It wasn't premeditated. It was the culmination of years of pain, addiction, and self-destruction erupting in one terrible moment. Lisa stood up, shaken, pale, and silent. Without a word, she walked out. Rick didn't move. He just sat there, in shock, in shame. The gravity of what he'd done hit him like a wave. He had crossed a line, and there was no going back. Act 1. Rick Holloway, Broken Crossroads. There are moments in life when something breaks inside a person, and no matter how hard they try, it can never be put back the same way. For Rick Holloway, that moment came at a small diner on the edge of town. The days that followed were a blur. Rick tried reaching out to Lisa, calling, texting, apologizing, but the silence was deafening. She didn't respond, and so, Rick unraveled. He drifted through the following weeks in a fog of guilt, regret, and desperation, hoping somehow that things might return to how they were before. But they never did. Lisa's family, growing increasingly concerned, contacted the police. Lisa had confided in her sister about what had happened that night. Soon after, Rick found himself facing formal charges, domestic assault. It all caught up with him faster than he could process. The alcohol that had once dulled his pain now offered no relief. He felt hollow, drained of the man he once thought he was. He tried to convince himself it wasn't real, that maybe this was just another bad chapter, but reality always knocks. One evening, there was a knock at the door. Rick opened it to find a police officer standing outside. The moment his name was spoken, Richard Holloway, he knew it was over. Lisa had filed a report. The officer explained the charges in a firm but calm voice. Rick stood frozen, numb, as those two words echoed in his mind, domestic assault. He didn't argue, didn't fight, just nodded as the citation was handed to him and was told to appear in court in the coming weeks. The nights that followed were long, sleepless. Rick stared at the ceiling, wondering how it had all come to this. How he'd let anger and addiction rot his soul. How he'd hurt the one person who'd shown him real care. He had two choices: keep spiraling down into oblivion, or face the consequences, confront his demons, and try to build something better from the wreckage. And for the first time in years, Rick felt a flicker of something buried deep beneath the shame. Hope. Act 2. Maria Santos and Ivan, the weight of redemption. As the early sun spilled across the streets of Sioux, the city stirred to life. But for Maria Santos, the day brought no peace, only the weight of a mother's pain. Her son Ivan had been arrested just weeks earlier, and life hadn't been the same since. She remembered him as a boy, quiet, thoughtful, always tinkering with toy cars on their living room floor. He used to dream of becoming a doctor or an engineer, but life in their neighborhood didn't nurture dreams, it crushed them. Ivan had tried to resist the pull of the streets. He worked as a mechanic, earning what little he could to help his mother. But Maria had always worried about the crowd he kept, the kind of friends who danced too close to the edge. And one night, Ivan slipped. Under pressure, financial, emotional, and social, he made a choice that would change his life forever. What began as a simple robbery spiraled into something far worse. The store owner resisted. A confrontation broke out, and by the time the police arrived, Ivan and his friends were in handcuffs. The charges were severe: armed robbery and attempted murder. Maria's heart shattered, not just from the crime, but from the loss of the boy she had once held so tightly, the boy who used to fall asleep to her stories of hope. But to Maria, he was still her son, still redeemable, still worth fighting for. She visited him every day in the cold, sterile county jail, watched the light fade from his eyes behind that glass, saw the boy grow quiet, hardened by a system that didn't care what dreams he once had. Maria spent sleepless nights combing through court documents, sitting in community outreach meetings, praying in silence. She refused to let him be swallowed whole by the world that had already tried to ruin them. And then, one night, a letter arrived. It was from Ivan. His handwriting was shaky, the words raw. He apologized for the pain he'd caused her. He admitted everything: his guilt, his shame, his fear, and for the first time, he spoke not as a victim of circumstance, but as a young man ready to face what he had done. That letter gave Maria something stronger than pain. It gave her purpose. She would fight for leniency, for rehabilitation, for a second chance. Because redemption, she believed, wasn't reserved for the lucky, it was earned in the dark. One small step at a time, and Ivan had taken his first step. Act 3. Ivan's trial, a mother's hope. Ivan's letter was smudged with ink and emotion, every word a window into the soul of a young man drowning in remorse. He spoke of guilt that ate away at him, of tears shed in his cold, lonely cell, and a desperate wish to turn back time. But buried within the pain was something else. Hope. Ivan wrote about the lessons he was learning behind bars, the importance of taking responsibility, the power of education, and the fragile belief in a better future, if only someone would give him the chance. Maria held the letter close to her chest, her hands trembling. Tears streamed silently down her face, because in that moment, she realized something: her son was still in there. The little boy who once dreamed of being an engineer, who used to fall asleep with comic books under his pillow. He wasn't gone, just buried beneath the weight of his own mistakes. And if he still had hope, then so did she. As the days turned into weeks, Maria clung to that flicker of light. Ivan had begun participating in every rehabilitation program he could access: anger management, literacy classes, vocational training. He wasn't just doing time, he was trying to change. Each Sunday, Maria visited, and with every visit, she saw something returning to his eyes. Not defiance, not self-pity, but a quiet resolve. He spoke to her about education, about purpose, about wanting to help other young men like him avoid the same road. Then, one afternoon, during a particularly emotional visit, he looked at her, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know I messed up, Mama, but I'm trying. I want to get out of here and make things right. I want to help other kids not end up like me." Maria's heart swelled, part pride, part pain. She knew he wasn't the same boy who'd been arrested, but she also knew the road ahead was uncertain and unforgiving. The community had begun to pay attention. Ivan's story wasn't just his anymore. It was every young man from their neighborhood who'd been swept up by poverty, by pressure, by desperation. And now the city was watching, holding its breath for the trial. Ivan's defense attorney, Roberto Mendoza, was one of the few people Maria trusted. Compassionate, pragmatic, and deeply respected. He promised they'd fight for Ivan, arguing for a sentence that reflected not just the crime, but the person Ivan was becoming. Still, Maria couldn't shake the fear. She'd seen too many like him vanish into the system. Good boys lost to cold numbers and crowded court dockets. She wasn't about to let her son become another statistic. The day of the trial arrived. Maria sat in the courtroom, hands tightly clasped, her heart pounding in her chest. The judge, stern but fair woman, called the court to order. The prosecution wasted no time. They painted Ivan as a threat, a young man involved in a violent robbery that left a store owner injured and traumatized. Witnesses testified. Surveillance footage was shown. The case, on the surface, was clear. But then it was Mendoza's turn. He stood and told a different story. one of a boy raised in a neighborhood forgotten by opportunity, crushed under the weight of systemic neglect. He spoke of Ivan's remorse, his commitment to rehabilitation, his willingness to own his mistakes. This wasn't a monster, Mendoza argued. This was a young man begging for a second chance. Maria listened, her heart aching. She didn't excuse what her son had done, but she knew what few others in that room could see. He was trying. During a recess, she stepped into the hallway. The silence pressed heavy around her. She had prayed for this moment, for her son to be seen, not just for the worst thing he'd done, but for the man he was trying to become. The trial stretched on for days, and then, finally the verdict. Ivan was convicted of the robbery, but the attempted murder charge dropped. The judge acknowledged the severity of his actions, but also recognized his efforts to change. His sentence would be reduced, with eligibility for parole after several years, contingent on continued rehabilitation. The courtroom fell silent. The judge's gavel echoed like a final heartbeat. Ivan turned and met his mother's eyes. Time stood still between them. Maria's chest tightened with emotion, part heartbreak, part relief. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. A chance. Epilogue. The slow climb in the weeks after the trial. Maria felt a strange mix of sorrow and gratitude. Ivan had avoided the harshest fate, but prison was still prison. The reality of his conviction loomed large. Still, he was alive, and the system, for once, had offered a sliver of hope. Maria visited every weekend. In those early days, she found her son worn down by isolation, by guilt, by the weight of his own reflection. She had never seen him so broken, but gradually by visit something shifted. He began to speak with more purpose, to stand a little taller, to smile, even if only faintly. He'd enrolled in every course he could: carpentry, literacy, even mentoring for younger inmates. He didn't see it as a punishment anymore. He saw it as a path, a place to rebuild from the rubble. And Maria, no matter how long it took, would be right there, cheering him on from the other side of the glass. Not just as his mother, but as his anchor, his witness, and his unwavering reminder that even from the darkest place, redemption is possible. Act 2. Ivan Santos. The shape of redemption. Some mothers wait for the return of their sons from war. Maria Santos waited for her son to return from himself. Ivan, once a boy full of promise, had become a man burdened by choices, mistakes he couldn't take back. But behind bars, something unexpected happened. He began to change. He signed up for every program the prison offered: anger management, educational workshops, group therapy. He started reading obsessively books on psychology, sociology, philosophy, trying to untangle how the boy who once helped his neighbors carry groceries became the man behind these walls. With help from a prison therapist named Gloria, Ivan began confronting his past. Piece by piece, they traced his pain-absent father, poverty, street survival, and the quiet anger that grew in silence. Gloria pushed him to see the truth. Your past explains you, but it doesn't excuse you. On a quiet Sunday visit, Maria noticed something different. Ivan looked grounded, not hardened, but stronger. There was a calm in his voice now, like the storm had passed inside him. "Mama," he said softly, "I've been reading a lot about people who change. I want to be one of them." Maria smiled through tears, her voice cracking with warmth. "I believe in you, mijo. I always have." This wasn't the first time he'd spoken of change, but something in the way he said it, his posture, his presence told her this time was different. The months that followed weren't perfect. There were setbacks, moments when the sentence felt too heavy, when the walls pressed in and hope felt small. But Maria never missed a visit. She became his lifeline, her words a reminder: this is not the end of your story. Word of Ivan's transformation began to spread. He tutored younger inmates, joined peer mentorship, even started a book group. He was no longer just serving time, he was reshaping who he was. Then one day, something unexpected happened at a prison-wide ceremony honoring inmates who had shown exceptional rehabilitation. Ivan was called to the stage. Maria sat in the front row, her heart racing. He stood before the crowd not as a broken man, but as someone rebuilding himself from the inside out. Today, Ivan began, voice steady. I realized that who I was is not who I have to be forever. I'm not proud of what I did, but I'm proud of who I'm becoming. And I promise when I leave this place, I won't waste the second chance I've been given. The room fell silent. No applause, just wait. Real, human wait. After the ceremony, in a quiet visitation room, mother and son embraced. For the first time in a long time, Maria felt peace. Not because her son was free, he wasn't, but because he was fighting to be. His journey wasn't over. The road would be long, but redemption had begun. Act 3. Amir Ramon, the night everything broke. In a sleepy coastal town in Indonesia where the days moved slowly and neighbors knew each other's names, something unthinkable shattered. The silence in the summer of 2015. The man at the center of it all was Amir Ramon. To the world, Amir seemed ordinary, respected, reliable. A hard-working man who ran a modest construction business, loved his children, and attended community events with a quiet smile. But beneath the surface a storm had been brewing. That June evening started like any other. Amir's wife, Sari, had just returned from a trip to see her family. The house sat quietly on the town's edge, bathed in the soft glow of dusk. But behind the garage door, Amir sat alone drinking. He'd been unraveling for months. Whispers in the community spoke of financial stress, temper flare-ups, jealousy. But no one imagined how deep the fracture truly ran. Around 7 p.m., Amir called his wife. At first, the conversation was simple. He said he was working late, that he'd be home soon. But Sari knew his voice too well. Something in his tone tight, slurred, off-sent, a chill down her spine. She kept the conversation light, asking about his day, trying to ease his mood. But his replies grew short, agitated. Sari had seen this side of Amir before, irritable, paranoid, brooding. But this time something was different. The call ended abruptly. Amir said he was coming home. Sari sat in the living room, clutching the phone long after the call ended. The house was silent, too silent. And somewhere in that stillness, a mother's instinct stirred. Something was wrong. What she didn't know was that the man walking toward their home wasn't just angry. He was on the verge of something irreversible. That night would become the darkest chapter in the town's memory. A quiet evening transformed into a nightmare. Act 4. The night the quiet died, the house was still. Sari sat alone in the living room. The soft tick of the wall clock marking each passing second. The children had already gone to bed, their gentle breathing echoing from down the hall, a small comfort in an otherwise uneasy night. She stared at her phone, thumb hovering over a contact, her sister, a friend, anyone. But she hesitated. How could she explain a fear she couldn't name? How do you warn someone about a feeling? Then, the front door creaked open. Amir stepped inside. He looked hollow, his eyes bloodshot, his walk unsteady. The neat, composed man she had once known was gone, replaced by someone disheveled, shirt wrinkled, hair damp with sweat. He reeked of alcohol, but beneath the stench was something more chilling, a faint, metallic scent, blood. He didn't speak, didn't even look at her. He drifted toward the kitchen, muttering under his breath, the words slurred and unintelligible. Sari sat frozen on the couch, a cold dread crawling through her veins. This wasn't the man she married. This was something else, something dangerous. From the kitchen, she heard drawers opening, clattering sounds, erratic and urgent, then the sharp scrape of steel. He emerged, holding a large kitchen knife, and for the first time in her life, Sari was truly terrified of the man she had once loved. Her voice failed her. Her feet refused to move. Then, without warning, he lunged. The blade caught the light just before it caught her arm. Pain shot through her as blood spilled instantly from the wound. She screamed a raw animal sound, but it only fueled Amir's rage. His eyes weren't just angry, they were vacant, as if he no longer saw her at all. She staggered back, trying to shield herself, but the second strike came quick, slashing across her leg, and she crumpled to the floor. Through blurred vision, she saw him advancing again, knife raised, but instinct kicked in. She reached behind her, grabbed a heavy glass vase from the counter, and swung with everything she had. It smashed into Amir's temple, throwing him off balance just enough. She didn't wait. She bolted out the door, into the humid night barefoot, bleeding, breathless. Behind her, she could hear him, his footsteps pounding against the floorboards. But she didn't stop. She ran until the lights of a neighbor's house appeared. She collapsed onto their doorstep, sobbing, body shaking, hands slick with her own blood. The neighbor acted fast. Police and paramedics arrived within minutes. Inside, the house officers found Amir sitting on the floor, still holding the knife, his shirt now soaked in blood. He made no attempt to flee. Act 5. Unmasking Amir Ramon. The investigation that followed peeled back the layers of Amir's life and revealed a man unraveling. His construction business was failing. He'd amassed heavy debt, lost major contracts, and had recently learned his company was on the brink of collapse. Behind the closed doors of his seemingly tidy life, he had been spiraling, drowning in alcohol and rage. But none of that excused what happened that night. Amir was arrested on sight and charged with attempted murder, aggravated assault, and a series of related crimes. News of the attack shocked the community. This was a man they thought they knew, a good father, a quiet husband, a dependable worker. But as the facts emerged, the facade crumbled. Neighbors who once praised his work ethic now spoke in whispers. How could they have missed the signs? The sudden outbursts, the isolation, the drinking. It had all been there, hidden in plain sight. Act 6. The trial, her truth, his silence. Sari survived, but survival came at a cost. The cuts and bruises healed, but the trauma lingered. She was treated at the hospital and released days later, her body weak, but her resolve strong. She knew she had to be there for her children, had to be their anchor in the chaos. They had slept through the attack, shielded by the innocence of sleep. But children always know when something breaks. Sari didn't give them details, just reassurances. One day, when they were older, she'd tell them the truth, not to scare them, but to help them understand how strength sometimes looks like simply surviving. In court, she took the stand, hands trembling, voice steady as she recounted every detail. The attack, the escape, the man who had once cradled their newborns, now trying to kill her. Amir sat expressionless throughout the testimony. When questioned by detectives, he gave a cold, factual account of that night. He acknowledged the knife, the wounds, the rage, but showed no remorse, no grief. Just a clinical detachment, as though describing someone else's crime. The prosecution presented a clear picture. A man who had internalized his failures, turned to alcohol, and lashed out violently. The defense pleaded diminished capacity, blaming the breakdown on financial strain, alcoholism, and untreated mental health issues. They claimed Amir was not a monster, just a man who snapped. But the jury saw through it. They saw the blood, they heard Sari's cries, and they read the truth in the silence Amir gave them. Act 4. After the storm, justice. reflection, and resilience. The courtroom was heavy with silence, the kind that settles in before a storm breaks. And when it did, it came not with thunder but with testimony. The prosecution spared no detail. They painted a haunting portrait of the brutality Sari had endured, blow by blow, scar by scar. The evidence left no room for doubt. Amir Ramon had not simply lost his temper, he had intended to destroy. The tension in the room was suffocating. Every word spoken felt like a wound reopened. But through it all, Sari sat upright, hands clasped, voice trembling but steady. Her testimony wasn't just evidence, it was a testament to survival. Each time she recounted what happened, the emotional toll deepened. But she never faltered. This was her moment to speak the truth, to finally hold him accountable. Even Amir's family, once a constant pillar of support, sat in disbelief. His parents, devastated, looked at their son not with pride but confusion. How had the kind, thoughtful boy they'd raised become a man capable of such monstrous violence? They whispered questions no parent wants to ask. Did we miss the signs? Were we blind to the darkness growing inside him? In the end, the verdict came swift and certain. Attempted murder, aggravated assault, multiple counts of domestic violence. The judge's voice echoed in the chamber as he handed down a lengthy sentence, one that reflected both the severity of Amir's actions and the permanent emotional wreckage left behind. Amir Ramon, once a respected man in his community, was now just another inmate behind steel bars, his fall from grace complete. But for Sari, the journey was far from over. The sentence may have brought a sense of justice, but it could never erase the trauma. Act 5. A quiet rebuilding in the days after the trial. The world didn't magically get better. Sari returned home to a house that no longer felt like hers. The walls still held echoes of what had happened. Her children, young, confused, clung to her with wide, uncertain eyes. They didn't fully understand what their father had done, but they felt the shift. They felt the weight. There were days when even Sari wasn't sure if things would ever be okay again. At night, when the kids were finally asleep, she'd sit by the window in silence, staring out into the darkness. Her mind drifted to the man Amir used to be, the man who once kissed her forehead in the morning, who promised to build a future with her. That man was gone, and yet she couldn't stop wondering, how did we get here? What did I miss? Could I have stopped it? The questions had no answers, so instead, she focused on survival. Therapy became her anchor. In the beginning, every session felt like tearing open old wounds. But slowly, she began to reclaim something that had been taken, her voice. Inside those quiet rooms, she didn't have to be strong. She could be broken. She could be honest. And from that honesty came healing. Act 6. The parallel paths. While Sari worked through her pain, Amir faced the grim monotony of prison life. Gone was the well-spoken community man. Now he was just another number in the system. His letters to Sari started off filled with apologies and pleas for forgiveness. But over time, they changed. Less remorse, more self-pity. He wrote about his suffering, his regrets, his struggles, but he never truly acknowledged the devastation he'd left behind. Not once did he ask about the children. It was as if his world had frozen on the night of the attack, unable or unwilling to move forward. Act 7. Reclamation. Sari, on the other hand, did move forward, slowly, step by painful step. She began rebuilding. She enrolled in a local college, finally chasing the degree she'd once put aside. Education, for her, wasn't just a path forward, it was an act of defiance. A refusal to let Amir's actions define what came next. She leaned on her family and friends, accepting support where once she would have suffered in silence. And little by little, the pieces came back together. She even began speaking at support groups for survivors of domestic violence. At first, her voice shook, but each time she stood in front of a room and told her story, the power came back. not just to her voice, but to her life. She met women with bruises of their own, some visible, some invisible, women who told her that her courage gave them hope. And for the first time in years, Sari felt proud, not of what had happened, but of what she had survived. Epilogue. What remains the story of Amir, Ramon, and Sari would forever echo through their community. A cautionary tale. A mirror held up to the face of unchecked rage, emotional suppression, and ignored red flags. It showed how easily trust can shatter, how quickly love can curdle into violence, how thin the line is between safety and danger, when silence is allowed to grow. But it also told a second story, the story of resilience, of a woman who refused to be reduced to victim mode, who faced the darkness head down for herself, for her children, for the future. Even now, there are nights when Sari still sits by the window. The scars remain, some on her skin, others deeper, harder to name, but there's a new rhythm to her life, a quieter strength, a house no longer haunted but healing. She doesn't pretend to be whole. She doesn't have to be. She just keeps moving forward, and that after everything is enough. Closure. For Sari, a survivor's rebirth, the attack on Sari left more than just physical scars. It exposed the dangers of unchecked anger, the cost of denial, and the devastating consequences of ignoring warning signs. But, from that trauma, came something else, a spark. Her story ignited vital conversations about mental health awareness, about addiction and recovery, and about the urgent need for early intervention in domestic violence cases. Though the damage could not be undone, the awareness it generated became a powerful step forward, one that echoed far beyond her own experience. For Sari, the most important part of healing wasn't found in headlines or courtroom sit, was internal. It was the realization that she was no longer defined by what had been done to her. For years, she had seen herself through the lens of others as a wife, a partner, a mother. But after the night of the attack, she discovered something else entirely. She was a survivor, a woman who had endured unimaginable fear and chose to live, a woman who refused to be trapped by the pain of her past. Each day brought new strength, new resilience, and a deeper understanding of who she truly was. Her journey wasn't over. The road ahead was uncertain, but she walked it with clarity, encouraged, no longer afraid of the shadows that once followed her. Years later, the scars began to fade, but the lessons remained that healing is not a destination. It's a fight, and in that fight, Sari had reclaimed her voice, her identity, and her power. Case 6, The Fraud Beneath the Smile. Thomas Langley, Los Angeles, 2016. In the sprawling suburbs of the City of Stars, one man seemed to shine brighter than the rest. Thomas Langley. Charming, articulate, the kind of man whose smile made you feel safe. He was clean-cut, well-dressed, and had just the right amount of charisma to fit into any social circle. To most, Langley was just another successful entrepreneur, polished and professional, with a consulting firm tucked neatly into a downtown office building. But beneath the designer suits and reassuring tone was a secret he had, guarded for years. Langley wasn't just a businessman. He was a master manipulator, orchestrating one of the most devastating Ponzi schemes Southern California had seen in a decade. The setup, a mask of success in his mid-30s. Langley had already built a reputation as a savvy investor. He mingled with high-net-worth clients, published articles on financial growth, and gave confident talks at business seminars across His firm, Langley Enterprises, appeared legitimate in every way. A modern office, a sleek website, a small but competent staff. He had all the trappings of success and knew exactly how to sell it. But behind the curtain, Langley was weaving lies into an elaborate web of fraud. His pitch was always the same. A rare high-return investment opportunity, exclusive and limited. He promised annual returns of 30 to 40%, sometimes even more. It sounded too good to be true, but Langley was incredibly convincing, and the lure of easy wealth proved stronger than caution for many. The game begins in the early days. Langley delivered. He paid out handsome returns to his first round of investors' money he secretly pulled from the pockets of newer ones. These early payouts became his marketing strategy. Satisfied clients told friends. Family members invested. Trust snowballed, but none of the money ever touched real investments. Langley wasn't growing wealth. He was shuffling it, building a financial house of cards that grew taller and shakier with each passing month. As millions poured in, Langley lived lavishly. Luxury cars, global travel, a mansion in the hills. He played the role of the self-made mogul flawlessly, always hiding the reality that he was simply robbing Peter to pay Paul. The collapse by 2018. The scheme had reached its breaking point. Langley had hundreds of investors, many of whom had sunk their life savings into his promises. Retirees, small business owners, young families hoping for a better future. But the flow of new money slowed, and with more investors requesting their payouts, Langley struggled to keep the illusion alive. Payouts became delayed. Excuses grew stranger, and the once friendly consultant became evasive and irritable under pressure. Whispers of fraud began to circulate. Some investors dug deeper and found that nothing added up. There were no real business ventures, no portfolios, no paper trail to explain the millions supposedly being managed. When authorities were finally alerted, they uncovered the full scale of Langley's deception. The losses were staggering. Millions vanished, families devastated, elderly couples bankrupt, businesses ruined. The aftermath: Langley was arrested and charged with multiple counts of fraud, wire fraud, grand theft, and money laundering. In court, prosecutors detailed how he'd used charm, deception, and fake financial reports to bleed his clients dry. Victims filled the courtroom. Some wept, others stared in silence, but they all came seeking justice for the lives Langley had upended. He showed little emotion during the trial. No apology, no remorse. Just the same practiced calm that had fooled so many. Langley was sentenced to 35 years in federal prison, with full restitution ordered, but few believed they'd see a single cent returned. Lingering damage, lasting lessons in the end. Thomas Langley wasn't just a fraudster. He was a mirror reflecting back society's thirst for quick wealth and easy answers. His story became a case study in how manipulation thrives under the guise of trust, and how the most dangerous predators often wear the kindest smiles. But, for his victims, the healing, much like Sirius, didn't begin with justice. It began with survival, a return to the basics, rebuilding, and learning the hard lesson that sometimes the people who seem safest are the ones we should fear the most. Crime, whispers the disappearance of Thomas Langley. Wasn't until months after the collapse that investigators finally understood the full scope of Thomas Langley's deception. By the time federal prosecutors brought the case to trial, Langley was long gone. He'd vanished without a trace, using the very funds he stole to erase his footprints. It's believed he fled the country, changing identities like suits, slipping past the grip of law enforcement. Despite being placed on the FBI's most wanted list, Thomas Langley became a ghost and echo in the corridors of power. A name whispered in federal offices, always just out of reach. But his absence didn't halt the devastation. By then, the damage had already been done. Langley's clients, hundreds of them, had invested their life savings, their inheritances, their children's college funds, and in return, they were left with nothing but hollow portfolios and shattered trust. Marriages crumbled, businesses collapsed, and retirements were erased. As the investigation deepened, a much darker portrait of Langley began to emerge. This wasn't just a man who got greedy. This was someone who had built his entire identity on fraud. Thomas Langley had never been who he claimed to be. Chapter 1: The Illusion of Success. Raised in a fading steel town in Pennsylvania, Langley's childhood was far from stable. His father an alcoholic, prone to violent rages. His mother emotionally distant, barely present. Langley learned early on that affection could be earned through manipulation. At least told the right way could get him out of anything by high school. He was already running small-time cons, convincing teachers to boost his grades, getting other students to cover for him, charming his way into trust, and quietly exploiting it. He attended a local college and majored in business, but his true education happened outside the classroom. He experimented with fake e-commerce websites, phony consulting services, and online identity scams. All small-scale but enough to sharpen his tools. By the time he graduated, Langley didn't just understand how to manipulate people. He thrived on it. Chapter 2. Building the Empire After College. Langley moved to New York City and briefly worked in finance long enough to learn the lingo, long enough to know what made investors tick. But it wasn't until he moved to Los Angeles that he found his perfect playground. The city was a haven for dreamers, hustlers, and people desperate to turn money into more money. And Langley? He played the role flawlessly. He launched Langley Enterprises, a supposed high-end consulting firm. The office was pristine ultra-modern furniture, a sleek downtown address, and a website that oozed legitimacy. He wore tailored suits, spoke with calm authority, and surrounded himself with attractive, well-spoken staff. He projected success, and people believed it. At first, Langley's services seemed legitimate. He helped small businesses optimize their finances, offered strategic growth advice, and promised access to exclusive high-yield investment opportunities. Clients trusted him. Word spread, and that's when the Ponzi scheme began. Chapter 3. The Rise and the Fall. Langley started small, targeting a handful of high-net-worth clients. He promised them double-digit returns, and made good on those promises at first. Of course, the payouts weren't coming from investments. They were coming from the next round of victims. His empire ballooned. By 2018, Langley was managing over $100 million in client funds. He lived extravagantly: private jets, exotic vacations, luxury cars, 5-star hotels, and he sold the illusion better than anyone. But behind the glamour, the cracks had started to form. Early investors were satisfied, but newer clients grew anxious. Payouts were delayed. Reports grew vague. Langley blamed market volatility, back-end restructuring, or pending acquisitions. Always with a smile. Always with a promise that the money was coming. Some began to file complaints. By late 2019, Langley's empire was buckling. He took desperate measures, pulling loans, maxing out credit, stalling payouts with elaborate excuses. But the walls were closing in. When several investors formally reported him to financial regulators, it triggered a full-scale federal investigation. Within weeks, the SEC was involved, then the FBI. But by the time authorities moved in to arrest him, Thomas Langley had disappeared. Chapter 4. The Ghost and the Fallout. Authorities scoured his properties. Accounts were drained. Laptops were wiped. Security footage revealed he'd left Los Angeles days before the raid, boarding a private charter flight under an alias. To this day, Langley remains one of the most elusive financial criminals in recent American history. Investigators would later uncover that Langley had used at least 5 separate identities in the past decade: offshore accounts, forged passports, and a network of shell companies had helped him vanish. What began as a charming consultant selling dreams became one of the largest financial frauds Los Angeles had ever seen. But what haunted victims most wasn't just the money, it was the betrayal. Langley hadn't just taken their savings, he'd taken their trust, their security, their belief in the system. And then he'd vanished, leaving behind a trail of broken lives, a mountain of debt, and a legend soaked in deceit. Crime whispers the hunt for Thomas Langley. By the time the Better Business Bureau raised its concerns, it was already too late. Langley's empire wasn't just cracking, it was imploding. And when authorities finally began digging into his so-called business practices, the truth emerged fast and brutal. It was a textbook Ponzi scheme. Investigators quickly uncovered the fraud. Langley had been siphoning funds from new investors to pay off earlier ones. There were no assets, no real investments, no legitimate business ventures. Just smoke, mirrors, and a polished lie. And the consequences were catastrophic. This wasn't just about a few angry investors. As the scope widened, authorities realized they were looking at a full-scale financial disaster. Hundreds of victims, millions lost, lives upended. While law enforcement scrambled to trace Langley's movements, he vanished. A nationwide manhunt was launched, but Langley had anticipated this. He was already gone. The people who had trusted him, ordinary families, retirees, professionals, were left in disbelief. How could the man they once saw as a financial genius betray them so completely? And yet, the story didn't end with his disappearance. The Follow-Task investigators worked tirelessly to track Langley's trail. The number of victims only grew. People came forward with stories of ruined families who lost their homes, small business owners wiped out, retirees stripped of everything they'd saved. Langley's scam had left behind a path of destruction that could never be fully repaired. Despite his sudden disappearance, the investigation pressed on. Years passed. The trail ran cold, but the FBI refused to close the case. Langley had orchestrated one of the most devastating financial frauds in Los Angeles history, and they intended to find him. But Langley had vanished into thin air. He left behind no paper trail, no digital footprint, no exploitable connections. His records were wiped, his accounts emptied, his identity erased. He had disappeared so cleanly it was as if he'd never existed, leaving only devastated victims and empty promises. And yet, one thing Langley didn't count on was them. The survivors fight back. The people he'd betrayed weren't ready to let it go. A grassroots movement began to take shape. Former investors, now victims, refused to fade into silence. They banded together, not just to grieve, but to fight. They formed support groups, tracked leads, pooled resources, and began launching their own private investigation into Langley's disappearance. If the system couldn't bring him to justice, they would. One of the first to step up was Rebecca Granta, former Silicon Valley executive. She had trusted Langley with a significant portion of her retirement fund, lured in by his confidence, his charm, his promises of high returns. But when he disappeared, she wasn't just left financially broken, she was emotionally gutted. To Rebecca, this was personal. She had given him her trust. He took everything. The shadow network. Rebecca began organizing meetings, gathering others like her victims who had lost savings, homes, and in some cases, borrowed money just to invest with Langley. Together, they hired cyber experts, private investigators, and financial analysts. They pored over documents, emails, offshore leads, anything that could crack the case. And slowly, a hidden network began to surface. They uncovered shell companies spread across multiple countries, transactions masked to look legitimate, a series of offshore accounts, some dormant, others quietly active, sending untraceable payments to unknown recipients. Langley hadn't just run a scam, he had built a criminal empire. He was still moving in the shadows. The breakthrough then, a breakthrough. After months of digging, Rebecca's team tracked down a named Jason Miller, a former associate of Langley's. Jason had helped run the scam from the inside, managing investor relations and helping construct the intricate web of lies. He had disappeared when the scheme collapsed, just like Langley. But now, he was living under an alias in a quiet town in Nevada. When Rebecca's team approached him, Jason was reluctant, fearful. But guilt had eaten away at him. He agreed to talk, in exchange for immunity. Jason began to unravel the secrets. Langley's safe house. Jason led them to a property on the outskirts of Los Angeles, not a lavish mansion, but a modest villa, tucked away from view. Inside, they found what they'd been: chasing 4 years, multiple fake passports, forged IDs, encrypted hard drives, a blueprint of his escape. Langley hadn't just fled, he had meticulously planned every step of his disappearance. Armed with this new evidence, Rebecca's group returned to the FBI. Jason's testimony was the missing piece. Authorities were finally able to reconstruct Langley's global scheme in full. What they discovered was staggering. Langley had created a vast web of shell companies, laundered funds through offshore networks, and continued to move money years after vanishing. He hadn't stopped. He was still out there. The legacy of a ghost, Thomas Langley, remains at large to this day. His name is now a byword for betrayal, manipulation, and greed. But for the victims he left behind, this was never just about justice. It was about dignity, about reclaiming the lives he shattered. And though Langley may have disappeared from sight, he never escaped the people who refused to forget. Crime Whispers, The Fall of Thomas Langley, and the Rise of Nicholas Carter. Thomas Langley had been running his Ponzi scheme for nearly a decade, manipulating investors, pocketing millions, and hiding behind a carefully crafted image of success. But behind the charm and spreadsheets, there was no real business, only lies. The full extent of his deception was more devastating than anyone had imagined. Entire savings were lost, futures vanished, families torn apart. What he left behind was far worse than fraud. It was ruin. For months, the FBI, private investigators, and the Relentless Victims Group, led by Rebecca Grant, worked tirelessly to track him down. Their search eventually led them to a quiet corner of Mexico. There, among a community of expatriates, Langley had reinvented himself. He'd changed his name, altered his appearance, and even launched a new business, another illusion to keep his past buried. But in 2022, his past finally caught up with him. Langley was arrested at a small cafe in Guadalajara for his victims. It was a bittersweet moment. There was relief, ease, but also a deep, aching reminder of everything they had lost. Lives had been destroyed. Some would never recover. Langley's empire had left a scar on the financial world, one that wouldn't fade easily. And while he was behind bars, the consequences of his greed still echoed loudly in the lives he shattered. Rebecca, once a high-powered executive, had transformed her pain into purpose. She traveled across the country, warning others about the dangers of financial fraud, sharing the red flags of schemes, just like Langley's. In 2023, Langley stood trial. His defense fought hard to soften the blow, but the evidence was overwhelming. He was sentenced to 30 years in federal prison. His once promising future was gone, but the real tragedy wasn't his downfall. It was the hundreds he left behind, the broken dreams, the destroyed trust, the emotional wreckage. Langley built his empire on lies and, in doing so, left a permanent stain on the lives he deceived. Though he may be imprisoned, the damage he caused will never be fully undone. Case 7: The Rise of Nicholas Carter. The year was 2018 in the heart of New York City. The streets buzzed with life, commuters flooding sidewalks, subways rumbling below. Among them walked a man who, at first glance, was just another professional navigating the chaos. But Nicholas Carter was anything but ordinary. In the financial circles where his name held weight, he was simply known as Nick. Late 30s, impeccably groomed, he had the presence of someone who belonged. He exuded confidence, intelligence, and a disarming charm. But behind the polished smile was a man of deception, a master manipulator, fluent in the language of trust and betrayal. Nicholas Carter had spent years perfecting the con. He studied psychology, human behavior, and the unspoken desires of the wealthy. He knew what people wanted and how to make them believe he could give it to them. In 2018, he launched what would become one of the most sophisticated investment scams in Manhattan's elite financial circles. He called it Carter Capital. On the surface, it was a private equity firm offering a high-yield, low-risk investment fund. Nicholas claimed it was built on insider access, exclusive opportunities, and cutting-edge strategies. In reality, it was a Ponzi scheme, a glittering illusion, fueled by greed and sustained by lies. He began modestly, targeting acquaintances from his finance days. He presented himself as a seasoned investor with an impressive and fabricated track record. As new investors came in, he paid small returns to the early ones, just enough to maintain the illusion of success, and the word began to spread. Entrepreneurs, CEOs, even celebrities started investing. They were drawn in by his charm, his confidence, and the seductive promise of more. Nicholas understood the psychology of wealth better than anyone, the allure of exclusivity, the hunger for high returns, the fear of being left out. He played on their desires and they fell for it. Carter Capital operated from a sleek Manhattan skyscraper, complete with modern decor, high-end tech, and a professional staff trained to sell the fantasy. Nicholas hosted lavish parties, wooing potential investors with cocktails, music, and whispered opportunities. To the outside world, he was the real deal, a young mogul on the rise. But like every great con, the cracks started to show. As the scheme grew, so did the pressure. The influx of new investors slowed, and Nicholas began to gamble. He diverted funds into high-risk real estate, obscure penny stocks, and speculative cryptocurrency projects, hoping for a miracle. Instead, the hole got deeper. The payouts dried up, the questions started, and the illusion began to crumble. Still, Nicholas refused to fold. He doubled down, relying on charm, manipulation, and bravado to keep the mask on. But time was running out, and behind the walls of Carter Capital, the collapse had already begun. Crime whispers the vanishing of Nicholas Carter hadn't just built a Ponzi scheme, he had built a kingdom, a web of fake returns, a fortress of shell companies, and a network of devoted followers who believed in his vision. He leaned on them, not just for money, but for power. To Nicholas, this wasn't just business. It was a game of influence, seduction, and control. Watching people hand over their life savings gave him a rush no market ever could. Every new investor was a conquest, another nod to his genius, another reminder that he could bend people to his will. He craved the admiration, he thrived on the fear, and he basked in the illusion of invincibility. But with every success, the stakes grew higher. Nicholas knew the risk. He knew that if anyone pulled back the curtain, everything would collapse. Yet he couldn't stop. He was too deep, too addicted to the high. And for a while, he stayed one step ahead. But in the fall of 2018, it all started to unravel. It began with a whistleblower, an employee from the early days of Carter Capital, sharp, detail-oriented woman who'd noticed strange inconsistencies in the firm's accounts, payouts that didn't match, money that vanished without explanation, a gnawing feeling that something was deeply wrong. She did what Nicholas never anticipated. She investigated. Quietly, methodically, she pulled records, cross-referenced payments, and tracked missing funds. What she found was explosive. The majority of the firm's assets were nowhere to be found. She went straight to the authorities, evidence in hand. And within weeks, the FBI launched a full-scale investigation. What they uncovered stunned even the most seasoned agents. Nicholas Carter had orchestrated one of the most elaborate financial frauds in New York history. Millions were gone, and Carter Capital was nothing more than a shell. But before the FBI could make a move, Nicholas did. He vanished. His office was gutted, phone lines dead, luxury apartments abandoned. Nicholas Carter had prepared for this. He always knew the day might come, and when it did, he slipped away without a trace. In the weeks that followed, investigators raced to catch up. They combed through financial records, monitored his known associates, and retraced every digital footprint. The search became a national manhunt, one of the most high-profile in recent memory. But Nicholas had planned too well. He had dozens of aliases, offshore accounts, false passports, a blueprint for disappearance. Asterisk, the man who once commanded the upper echelon of New York's elite was now a ghost, a whisper in backroom conversations, a name met with silence and disbelief. The fallout, the damage left behind was catastrophic. Nicholas hadn't just stolen money, he had stolen trust. Entire communities of investors were left reeling. These weren't just faceless victims. These were real people with real dreams. Some had invested their children's college funds, others, their retirement. For many, it was their last shot at financial stability. Among the most devastated was Victoria Grant, a high-profile socialite and philanthropist. Victoria had been one of Nicholas's earliest champions. He courted her with charm, exclusivity, and promises of extraordinary returns. At first, she'd been cautious, but Nicholas made her feel special, like an insider. She bought into the dream, hosted events, promoted Carter Capital to her inner circle, and convinced others to follow her lead. When the truth came out, the betrayal was unbearable. She had lost millions, but worse, she'd lost her reputation. Years of careful social navigation and philanthropic credibility were now tainted by association. With the con, Victoria stepped out of the spotlight. Not because she had to, but because the shame was too much to bear. She wasn't alone. Alan Simmons, a successful tech entrepreneur, had invested heavily in Carter Capital, millions of dollars, to secure his company's future and fund his eventual retirement. He believed Nicholas was the key to long-term stability. But what he got instead was disaster. His company began hemorrhaging cash. Investors pulled out. Confidence crumbled. The revelation left Alan in disbelief. He had built his business from scratch, but his mistake trusting Nicholas threatened to destroy everything. It wasn't just a financial loss. It was a personal betrayal. Nicholas Carter had become a trusted advisor to dozens, and he had turned that trust into his greatest weapon. The web unravels as investigators dug deeper. They uncovered a network of deception so complex it looked like a corporate thriller. Nicholas had created dozens of fake companies, shell corporations, bogus partnerships, falsified documents that spanned continents. Each layer was designed to mislead, each record manipulated to hide the truth. Yet even the most carefully constructed lies couldn't hold forever. Despite his planning, the cracks were widening. The FBI, now working alongside forensic accountants, began to connect the dots. They tracked offshore wire transfers, digital signatures, and encrypted messages. Each clue painted a clearer picture of the empire Nicholas had built and abandoned. But the man himself, still missing. Nicholas Carter had vanished into the wind. His once flawless world had crumbled, and the people he left behind were left to sift through the wreckage. He had controlled everything until the truth caught up, and when it did, he ran. To this day, some say he's living in a private villa in South America. Others claim he died under a false name in Eastern Europe. But one thing is certain, Nicholas Carter became a ghost, and the echoes of his betrayal still haunt the lives he destroyed. The true scale of Nicholas Carter's scam was staggering. As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered a classic Ponzi scheme, one built on lies, illusion, and financial desperation. Nicholas had been taking money from new investors to pay off older ones, all while promising returns that were too good to be true. At the heart of it all was a dangerous gamble. Nicholas had sunk millions into high-risk ventures, particularly in the outer boroughs of New York. He bet heavily on luxury real estate developments, believing a booming market would make him mend his investment. But the market didn't perform as expected, and his projects began to fail. At the same time, he had plunged investor funds into volatile stocks and cryptocurrencies, hoping quick profits would mask the cracks forming beneath the surface. But it was a dangerous game. The scheme demanded constant cash flow and relentless deception to stay afloat. As pressure mounted, Nicholas took even bigger risks. He began siphoning investor money into his personal lifestyle: lavish vacations, designer clothing, extravagant gifts. His outward success was a performance, meticulously crafted to maintain the illusion of wealth and control. But behind closed doors, it was chaos. The FBI, now fully engaged in the case, faced a formidable challenge. Nicholas was a master manipulator with a well-constructed web of fake companies, dummy corporations, and offshore accounts. He used encrypted communication, burner phones, and layers of financial misdirection to stay hidden. Meanwhile, the public fallout was devastating. Victims scrambled to recover their losses, though many knew they would never see a dime again. The emotional toll was even greater than the financial. Trust had been shattered, and for many, self-doubt lingered long after the money was gone. Nicholas Carter had conned New York's elite and left behind a legacy of betrayal. Among those hardest hit was Victoria Grant, a prominent philanthropist and socialite. She had been one of Carter Capital's most vocal supporters, lured in by Nicholas's charm and polished persona. She trusted him not just with her fortune, but with her name, and he had used both to expand his empire of lies. When the truth unraveled, Victoria was left devastated financially and personally. Her reputation, built over decades of charity work and careful networking, was in jeopardy. Her peers, once close friends, distanced themselves, too ashamed to admit they'd been fooled, too embarrassed to speak of it. Alan Simmons, a visionary tech entrepreneur, faced ruin as well. He had invested millions, believing Carter Capital would secure his startup's future. Instead, his trust was betrayed, his business thrown into turmoil. Investors pulled out, wary of any connection to Nicholas's crumbling empire. Alan's confidence was shaken. He had built his company from the ground up, but nothing had prepared him for the devastation of being conned by someone he'd considered an ally. The scam, it turned out, reached far beyond New York. Nicholas had operated nationwide, targeting victims in cities like Chicago, Los Angeles, and Miami. He infiltrated financial circles with ease, masking his deception behind a magnetic personality and the promise of untold wealth. As time passed, the odds of catching Nicholas grew slimmer. He had vanished without a trace, and the FBI had little to go on. But behind the scenes, a relentless team of forensic accountants was hard at work. They combed through thousands of documents, following the money trail through an intricate web of shell corporations, offshore accounts, and forged identities. Their findings were explosive. Nicholas hadn't just fooled wealthy individuals, he had conned small and mid-sized banks, too. Through fake loans, false transactions, and sophisticated laundering tactics, he had moved millions undetected. The fraud was so elaborate that agents began to suspect inside help. Whispers of collusion suggested that Nicholas had allies in the financial world, individuals who had turned a blind eye for a cut of the profits. Weeks turned into months, and still, Nicholas Carter remained a ghost. His disappearance became legend, a mystery with no resolution, a cautionary tale whispered among Wall Street boardrooms and socialite dinners alike. He had promised wealth and delivered ruin, and then he was gone. Nicholas Carter had vanished. The once charming financier who dazzled New York's elite was now a ghost, gone without a trace, leaving behind only the wreckage of ruined lives and stolen fortunes. His former clients, consumed by a toxic mix of rage and regret, were left grasping at the ruins. Many filed lawsuits in a desperate attempt to recover their losses, but the truth was unavoidable. Nicholas had hidden the money well. His assets were buried beneath layers of offshore accounts, shell corporations, and false identities, far beyond the reach of most. And yet, even in the face of overwhelming odds, some still clung to hope. Maybe he'd slip up. Maybe his hunger to enjoy his ill-gotten wealth would betray him. They needed only one mistake, one thread to pull, and then, on a quiet winter evening, that thread finally surfaced, An informant, someone from Nicholas's inner circle who had turned on him, stepped forward. He claimed to have intimate knowledge of Carter's final days before disappearing. According to him, there had been a meeting in a sleek upscale restaurant in Miami. Nicholas was seen conferring with figures well known in the underground world, individuals connected to organized crime and money laundering networks. The FBI followed the lead to a storage unit nestled in a nondescript Miami warehouse. Inside, they uncovered a treasure trove of clues: designer clothing, hidden stacks of cash, and multiple forged passports bearing different names. Documents revealed that Nicholas had been preparing to flee the country. It was all there, proof of his calculated escape plan. But perhaps the most telling detail was this: despite his intricate schemes, he hadn't accounted for the FBI's relentless pursuit. As the manhunt reignited, Nicholas Carter's saga once again dominated headlines. His story became a warning to investors everywhere: beware of too good to be true. Returns and silver-tongued strangers promising the world. He was no longer just a criminal. He was a symbol of unchecked greed, of blind trust, gone disastrously wrong. But Nicholas was still out there somewhere, and while the authorities narrowed in, the victims of his fraud were left to pick up the shattered pieces of their lives. The Carter case wasn't just about money, it was about betrayal, disillusionment, and the price of believing in a lie. Case 8, Luke Davidson, The Startup Mirage, Spring 2016, Los Angeles, California. A city where glitz meets ambition became the backdrop for a scandal that would shake both the financial world and Hollywood's elite. The man behind the deception was Luke Davidson, a rising star in the tech scene, known for his charm, style, and carefully curated social media presence. Standing at Situ with a chiseled jaw, designer suits, and a polished beard, Luke looked every bit the modern mogul. He moved in celebrity circles, appeared at exclusive events, and posted snapshots of himself in private jets, luxury cars, and high-rise office suites. To the outside world, he was the American dream incarnate, but the truth was far darker. Luke came from modest beginnings. Raised in a middle-class home on the outskirts of LA, he had always been driven. By the time he entered university, he had developed a fascination with finance and emerging technologies. He was particularly enamored by the rise of Silicon Valley and the gold rush of tech startups. He wanted in. His early ventures failed, but Luke was a master storyteller. He spun his losses as lessons, setbacks as growth. By 25, he had already founded and folded 2 startups, but still managed to maintain a loyal network of backers. His secret: a magnetic personality and an uncanny ability to say exactly what investors wanted to hear. Then came Nova Ventures. Founded in 2015. Nova was billed as a cutting-edge tech firm poised to revolutionize industries through artificial intelligence and blockchain. Luke claimed it would transform everything from healthcare to finance. His pitch was intoxicating, visionary, urgent, and wrapped in the promise of exponential returns. He hosted invite-only investor dinners at Michelin-starred restaurants. He personally called major venture capitalists to promise they were just weeks away from a breakthrough. His offices, sleek and modern, were always filled with young engineers who looked the part even if they weren't doing anything at all. His Instagram painted the picture of a thriving tech company on the verge of changing the world. The money poured in. Investors from across the country bought into Luke's dream. Celebrities endorsed him. Financial publications named him one of LA's brightest stars under 30. His name was synonymous with success. But behind the glass walls and staged photo shoots, there was no product, no breakthrough, no innovation. Nova Ventures was a carefully constructed illusion. The tech didn't exist. The engineers were actors. The prototypes were mock-ups, and the money, it was being siphoned off into personal accounts, luxury trips, and a lavish lifestyle that masked the growing void behind the company's facade. Luke Davidson wasn't building a business, he was building a house of cards, and soon, it would all come crashing down. Nova Ventures had no groundbreaking technology. There was no revolutionary AI, no blockchain innovation, no product at all. It was nothing more than an empty shell of front designed to attract funding and fuel a lifestyle built entirely on lies. Luke Davidson was siphoning investor money into a life of unimaginable luxury sports cars, penthouse condos, private jets, and endless nights at elite venues. Behind the scenes, he maintained a network of associates who helped prop up the illusion, drafting fake documents, creating fabricated email trails, and posing as company staff. But as the months passed, the cracks in the foundation began to show. A few sharp-eyed investors began asking questions. Their patience wore thin. Where were the products? Why were progress reports vague and inconsistent? And how, with all the money raised, was there still nothing tangible to show for it? Luke remained calm, reassuring. He blamed development delays, the complexity of the technology, the need for confidentiality. He dangled promises of an imminent public offering that would make them all rich. But behind his polished smile, panic had started to set in. By early 2016, some investors began to dig deeper into the company's finances. What they uncovered was alarming. Discrepancies in financial statements, missing funds, dead-end leads. It didn't take long before independent investigators confirmed the truth. Nova Ventures was a scam. No engineers, no breakthroughs, no innovation. Luke had been funneling the money into personal accounts, offshore holdings, and shell corporations. When the FBI got involved, the illusion crumbled almost overnight. Realizing the walls were closing in, Luke made his move. He began distancing himself from Nova Ventures, claiming he was on an extended business trip abroad. But in reality, he was already fleeing, slipping away, just as investigators closed in. By the time authorities tried to track him down, Luke Davidson had vanished. The media pounced on the story. The tale of a handsome young tech mogul who had swindled millions became headline news. Los Angeles, a city built on dreams and spectacle, had now become the backdrop of one of its most spectacular financial deceptions. Luke's disappearance launched a massive investigation. The FBI, financial crime units, and private investigators fanned out across the country. But Luke had planned his exit meticulously. He had wiped his digital presence, abandoned his properties, and disappeared under layers of false identities. His last known trace, a vague claim of a business trip to Europe. In the weeks and months that followed, the victims of Nova Ventures began to find each other. Anger turned into solidarity. Many of Luke's investors were public figures themselves, celebrity, high-profile venture capitalists, and respected tech entrepreneurs who had all been taken in by the same illusion. Some had invested millions. Others had placed their entire life savings in Luke's hands. Among them was Emily Park, a highly regarded Silicon Valley investor and one of Luke's earliest and most vocal backers. Emily had met Luke at a prestigious tech conference in San Francisco. He was charismatic, visionary, his pitch compelling. He spoke of a future powered by AI and blockchain, and even introduced her to his supposed team of brilliant engineers and researchers. It all felt real, but it wasn't. The team was nothing more than a group of actors hired to play roles in Luke's elaborate charade. There were no developers, no scientists, no innovation. Emily was devastated, not just by the financial loss, but by the betrayal. She had believed in Luke. She had vouched for him, and now her reputation was on the line. The weight of that shame was almost unbearable. As the victims began comparing their stories, a pattern emerged. Luke had mastered the psychology of persuasion. He didn't just sell an idea, he sold a fantasy. He made them feel chosen, important, part of something revolutionary. They weren't just backing a startup. They were part of a movement, or so they thought. And when it all fell apart, they weren't just left with financial losses, they were left questioning their own judgment, their instincts, and their credibility. Some investors suffered in silence. their social standing tarnished by their association with Luke. Others banded together, filing civil suits in an attempt to recover what they could, but the damage was done. For many, the wounds ran deeper than balance sheets. Luke hadn't just stolen their money, he had taken their trust. Meanwhile, the manhunt intensified. The FBI traced Luke's last confirmed location to a private airfield in Los Angeles. Security footage showed him boarding a small international flight, but the manifest listed a false identity. His digital footprint had been wiped clean, his bank accounts drained and closed. His social media scrubbed. Luke Davidson had vanished into thin air. Luke Davidson's last confirmed sighting placed him at a private airport in Los Angeles, boarding a jet bound for an undisclosed location. From that moment forward, he vanished without a trace. Investigators scoured every possible lead, tracking his bank activity, analyzing his digital footprint, and interrogating known associates, but Luke always seemed to be one step ahead. His disappearance wasn't a panic-driven escape. It was calculated, meticulous, and years in the making. With extensive knowledge of the digital world, Luke had erased himself. He used burner phones, encrypted communications, and a maze of aliases to stave off the grid. Even those who had helped him build Nova Ventures, the shell company at the heart of his scam, were either untraceable or unwilling to talk. As law enforcement scrambled to catch up, the media latched onto the story. The public was gripped by the tale of the charismatic tech entrepreneur who had swindled millions. Investigative journalists dug deep, unearthing testimonies from former Nova Ventures employees. What they revealed painted a chilling picture. The company had never truly existed. It was nothing more than glossy brochures, buzzword-laden presentations, and a dream that Luke had sold with frightening conviction. Inside the faux headquarters, anyone who dared question too much was quickly silenced or dismissed. Luke Davidson wasn't just a con artist, he was a master manipulator. He knew how to sell belief, and in a world driven by dreams of innovation and overnight success, that made him dangerous. As the investigation intensified, a disturbing pattern emerged. Nova Ventures hadn't been Luke's first deception. His earlier failures were merely training grounds, each scam refining his skills. Each investor lost, becoming a lesson in how to better perfect the illusion. Armed with this new understanding, the FBI began following the money trail across international borders. Luke had funneled his stolen millions through shell companies registered in tax havens like the Cayman Islands and Luxembourg, jurisdictions known for secrecy and limited oversight. Every company looked legitimate on paper, but each was another piece of Luke's intricate web of fraud. While authorities chased leads across continents, Luke's victims were left to grapple with more than just their financial losses. Many had trusted him with their personal ambitions, their vulnerabilities. Some had even seen him as a mentor, or worse, a friend. He hadn't just conned them out of money, he had stolen their belief in themselves. One of those victims was Jake Morrison, a prominent venture capitalist from Silicon Valley. Jake had been among Luke's earliest supporters, not only investing millions, but introducing him to other high-profile backers. He had believed in Luke, wholeheartedly believed he was supporting the next revolutionary innovator. In hindsight, Jake couldn't understand how he had missed the signs. In the months after the scandal broke, Jake relived every conversation, every promise, every gut instinct he had ignored. He had built a career on his ability to read people, and now he was facing the most humiliating failure of his professional life. His reputation was in shambles, and Jake wasn't alone. As investors compared stories, they uncovered the emotional manipulation at the core of Luke's strategy. He had read them like a book, appealing to their deepest hopes and their fear of being left behind. He had made them feel chosen, like they were part of something destined to change the world. Back at the FBI, a breakthrough finally emerged: a set of encrypted emails traced back to Luke, sent from burner accounts. Though heavily disguised, metadata confirmed they were from him. The emails outlined plans to launch a new set of ventures under false identities, under round of fraud, this time more sophisticated than ever. Luke wasn't hiding. He was plotting. Investigators now knew they were racing against the clock. Luke had built an underground reputation as someone who could outsmart law enforcement. He had a global network of contacts who specialized in erasing trails, and he had already used them to slip through the cracks once. But the walls were closing in, with an international arrest warrant now in place. Luke was finally tracked to a luxury yacht anchored off the coast of Brazil. He was living under yet another alias, aboard a sleek vessel, registered to one of his many phantom shell companies, as federal agents and Brazilian authorities coordinated for a takedown. They knew time was critical. Luke had proven himself willing to go to extreme lengths to escape, and with a loyal inner circle still in play, there was no telling how far they'd go to protect him. The operation was risky, and the stakes were high, but for the countless victims, he left behind those who lost their savings, their reputations, and their trust in people. The takedown of Luke Davidson wouldn't just be justice, it would be redemption. The threat Luke Davidson posed was not just financial, it was psychological. His ability to deceive and manipulate wasn't lost on authorities, which is why the final confrontation was approached with extreme caution. When the time came, the operation was swift and meticulous. In the dead of night, Brazilian federal agents, in close coordination with the FBI, stormed the luxury yacht, where Luke had been hiding under yet another false identity. Despite all his contingency plans and digital misdirection, Luke was caught completely off guard. This time, he wasn't able to outmaneuver his pursuers. He was taken into custody without incident and immediately extradited to the United States to stand trial for the extensive web of fraud, conspiracy, and money laundering he had spun for his victims. The news of his capture brought mixed emotions. Relief was common, but so was resentment. Years of financial ruin and emotional betrayal couldn't be undone with an arrest. Still, for many, there was solace in the fact that Luke would finally be forced to answer for what he had done. Luke's trial quickly became a media spectacle. The courtroom was packed with victims, many of them emotionally drained, still reeling from the collapse of their dreams. Among them was Jake Morrison, the Silicon Valley venture capitalist, who had once stood firmly in Luke's corner. When Jake took the stand, he recounted how thoroughly he had been misled, how Luke's charm had overridden his business instincts and cost him not just millions, but his credibility. It was a cathartic moment. As Jake spoke, the shame that had haunted him for months began to lift. It would take years to rebuild his reputation, but this testimony was the first step toward closure. Luke Davidson was found guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. His assets were seized, and restitution efforts began, though most victims knew they'd never recover the full extent of their losses. The damage Luke left behind was deep. Financial wounds could heal in time, but emotional ones, trust broken, dreams shattered, would take longer. Still, something remarkable happened in the wake of his downfall. Victims began to speak out. No longer silenced by shame, they became advocates for financial literacy and fraud awareness. Conferences, community events, online forums, they told their stories everywhere they could, warning others about the dangers of charismatic predators like Luke. Unwittingly, Luke had sparked a movement. Though his empire was built on lies, the collapse of it ignited a push for truth, one that might help protect future generations from falling for similar scams. Case 9. In 2017, another elaborate deception made headlines across Utah, this time at the hands of a man named Tom Henderson. On the surface, Tom was an ordinary man, raised in Salt Lake City. He was known for his friendly demeanor and apparent passion for helping others. A self-proclaimed financial guru, he promised to help people achieve independence through high investment opportunities. At a glance, Tom looked like any other eager entrepreneur, charismatic, persuasive, and full of confidence. But beneath that warm exterior was a mind wired for manipulation. What followed was one of the most calculated fraud schemes the state had ever seen. Tom had always been a smooth talker. From a young age, he had a gift for making people believe in his potential, even when his credentials told a different story. After briefly attending community college, he bounced between jobs, selling insurance, cars, dabbling in real estate, but nothing ever stuck. It wasn't until he entered the world of online investment forums that he found his true calling, not in making money, but in convincing others to hand theirs over. In 2015, Tom launched Henderson Financial Solutions, a company that claimed to offer clients access to exclusive high-yield opportunities in stocks, real estate, and cryptocurrency. The website was polished and filled with glowing testimonials, all of them fake. The investments he pitched didn't exist, but the presentation was convincing. Tom branded himself as a mentor, man who had made mistakes and now wanted to guide others toward financial success. He hosted seminars, ran webinars, and offered costly one-on-one coaching sessions. Clients paid hundreds, sometimes thousands, for access to his so-called expertise. At first, everything seemed legitimate. Early investors received returns funded, of course, by money from new investors. It was a classic Ponzi scheme, dressed up in modern digital marketing. People believed in Tom. Some even idolized him. They referred their friends and families, convinced they'd found a financial savior. But Tom wasn't investing a dime. Instead, he funneled money into his own lifestyle: luxury cars, designer clothes, high-end parties. His presence at exclusive events further cemented his image as a successful mogul. Eventually, the cracks began to show. By 2017, new investments had slowed, and Tom struggled to maintain payouts. Debt piled up, but rather than confessing, he doubled down, offering even higher returns for larger investments, luring desperate clients with bold promises and manipulative charm. One of those clients was Angela Stevens, a single mother of two. Case 9 continued. Angela Stevens had been struggling financially for years, a single mother doing her best to make ends meet. She was desperate for a way out, anything that might offer her children a better future. When she attended one of Tom Henderson's financial seminars, she was instantly captivated. Tom spoke with the ease of a seasoned motivator. He painted vivid pictures of ordinary people who had turned modest incomes into real wealth, families who'd gone from living paycheck to paycheck to owning multiple properties and traveling the world. His promises felt bold, yet strangely believable. Angela, inspired and yearning for change, took a leap of faith. She liquidated her modest savings and invested $115,000 into one of Tom's high-yield opportunities. At first, it seemed like she had made the right choice. Small returns trickled in just as Tom had promised, and the illusion of financial freedom began to take root. She was hooked. Over the following months, Angela sent in more money, believing she was on the verge of the breakthrough she had long dreamed of. The testimonials kept coming. Success stories flooded Tom's webinars and social media feeds. He seemed unstoppable. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. Angela began to sense something wasn't quite right. Other investors she'd met at seminars or in online communities were reporting delays, missed payments, vague excuses, and in some cases, no returns at all. The once transparent communication began to vanish. Emails went unanswered. Phone calls rang out to voicemail. And then, Tom disappeared entirely. Panicked, Angela reached out to others who had invested with him. What she heard confirmed her worst fears. One former client revealed he had invested nearly $30,000 with Tom money. That vanished without a trace. The full weight of the deception hit her. She hadn't just lost money, she had been conned. And she wasn't alone. As more victims came forward, it became clear that Tom had orchestrated an elaborate Ponzi scheme. For over 2 years, he had been using funds from new investors to pay off earlier ones, creating the illusion of a profitable enterprise while secretly enriching himself. Behind the polished website, the sleek branding, and the false promises were layers of deceit. Authorities launched a full investigation, and it didn't take long to expose the scope of Tom's operation. He had constructed a web of fake businesses, shell companies, and false identities, designed to funnel stolen money into his private accounts. On the surface, his companies looked legitimate. They had professional websites, registered LLCs, and polished promotional materials, but they were nothing more than empty shells. As the investigation deepened, law enforcement discovered the full extent of Tom's lavish lifestyle: luxury homes, exotic vacations, expensive cars, all funded by the savings of people like Angela. But the most devastating discovery was the emotional toll his scheme had taken. Victims weren't just financially ruined, they were emotionally shattered. Some had invested their life savings. Others had borrowed from family and friends, chasing the promise of prosperity. Angela, devastated but determined, joined a growing movement of victims who were no longer willing to stay silent. Together, they filed complaints, launched online support groups, and shared their stories publicly in hopes of both finding justice and warning others. The community of victims grew stronger. What had begun as private grief transformed into public resolve. They were no longer just victims, they were survivors. The breakthrough came when a former associate of Tom Swan, involved in one of his fake businesses, came forward. Initially unaware of the full scheme, the associate began to suspect foul play when their own payouts stopped. After conducting an investigation of their own, they realized the truth and decided to cooperate with authorities. This whistleblower handed over key evidence, documents, communications, and information about Tom's hidden assets, tactics, and even accomplices. With this new intel, law enforcement closed in. Tom was finally located in a small town in northern Utah. Living under a fake name, he had taken a job as a tech consultant and was blending into the local community. But no amount of false identity could shield him anymore. A SWAT team moved in swiftly, raiding the suburban home where he was staying. Tom was arrested without resistance, but the damage he left behind would take years to repair. In early 2018, Tom Henderson's trial began. The courtroom overflowed with victims who traveled from across the country to testify. Their stories painted a devastating portrait of betrayal. Angela Stevens was among them. When she took the stand, her voice trembled. She spoke of her children, her lost dreams, and the trust she had placed in a man who had promised her hope and delivered ruin. Her words cut deep, resonating with everyone in the courtroom. Tom sat, expressionless, barely reacting as his victims poured out their pain. His defense attorney claimed that Tom had simply made bad business decisions, that he was at worst a greedy entrepreneur, not a criminal. But the evidence was overwhelming. Eventually, Tom agreed to a plea deal in exchange for a reduced sentence, in cooperation with authorities. He pled guilty to multiple counts of fraud, wire fraud, and money laundering. He was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. For many, the sentence felt like a slap on the wrist. The damage was too great, the scars too deep. But for Angela and others, it was at least a step toward accountability. The courtroom may not have restored what they lost, but it gave them a platform, a chance to be heard, to face the man who betrayed them, and to reclaim part of the power he had stolen. Tom Henderson's empire of lies had finally collapsed, and from its ruins, a new kind of strength began to emerge, one built not on false promises, but on truth, solidarity, and the voices of those who refused to be silenced. Case 9. The Illusion of Wealth. The rise and fall of Tom Henderson. For years, Angela Stevens had struggled financially, so when she attended one of Tom Henderson's seminars, she was immediately drawn in. Tom's confident speeches, filled with tales of ordinary people turning modest incomes into real estate empires, were persuasive. He painted a vivid picture of freedom, of wealth, of finally breaking free from the paycheck-to-paycheck grind, desperate to create a better future for her children. Angela decided to take a chance. She emptied her savings account and invested $115,000 into one of Tom's so-called high-yield opportunities. At first, the returns trickled in small, but enough to feel real. Encouraged, Angela sent more money. She wasn't alone. Dozens of others, equally hopeful, bought into Tom's promise of financial independence. But beneath the polished seminars and curated success stories, something felt off. Angela began noticing other investors were experiencing delays. Some weren't receiving payouts at all. When she reached out to Tom, the responses grew slower until they stopped altogether. Then he vanished. The illusion began to shatter. It wasn't until she spoke to a former client, someone who had also been duped, that the full extent of the scam became clear. This man had lost $30,000. The money had disappeared without a trace. Angela's stomach dropped. She had been scammed. As she searched for answers, Angela discovered she wasn't alone. There were dozens, perhaps hundreds of victims. Together, they began sharing their stories, contacting authorities, and piecing together what Tom had done. Law enforcement soon uncovered the truth. Tom Henderson had been running a sophisticated Ponzi scheme for over 2 years. New investors' money had been used to pay old investors, all while Tom enriched himself. His operation was meticulously disguised. He used fake names, forged documents, and created shell companies with slick websites and professional branding. But behind the facade, it was all a house of cards. Authorities traced his digital footprint, tracking him to a small town in northern Utah. He was living under a fake name and working as a consultant for a tech company. A SWAT team raided the home where he was hiding. Tom was arrested without resistance. In early 2018, his trial began and quickly became a national spectacle. Victims traveled from across the country to testify. Their stories were heartbreaking: homes lost, marriages ruined, children's futures stolen. Angela Stevens took the stand, her voice trembling as she described how trusting Tom had led to the most painful decision of her life. She had believed in his dream and lost everything. Throughout the trial, Tom showed little remorse. His defense claimed he had simply made bad business decisions, but the mountain of evidence said otherwise. Eventually, Tom Henderson pled guilty to multiple counts of fraud, wire fraud, and money laundering. He was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. For many of his victims, it wasn't enough. The emotional damage couldn't be undone by a prison sentence. Angela and others had to face the aftermath, rebuilding their lives, careers, and sense of trust. Angela, once the most vocal among the victims, struggled deeply. The money was gone, but it was the shame and guilt that lingered. How could she have believed him? Every financial decision she made afterward was weighed down by self-doubt, but healing slowly began. Some victims turned to therapy, others to community support. Angela eventually began speaking at local events, warning others about scams, and sharing her hard-earned knowledge. She became an advocate for financial literacy. Determined to help others avoid the path she had walked, Tom Henderson's name became synonymous with financial fraud in Utah. His story was studied in business schools and used in seminars as a stark warning. His downfall spurred local and federal authorities to tighten their efforts, implement stronger oversight, and improve fraud detection methods. And though the headlines faded, the lessons remained. Angela emerged, changed, not broken, but battled. The promise of easy money had vanished, replaced with hard-won wisdom. She would never be fooled again. Case 10 Fire Festival, the paradise that never was. In 2017, a music festival promised to redefine luxury and exclusive, sun-drenched weekend in paradise. The Fire Festival, spearheaded by entrepreneur Billy McFarland and rapper Ja Rule, was marketed as the ultimate escape: gourmet meals, private beachfront villas, and performances by top-tier artists on the idyllic island of Great Exuma in the Bahamas. Social media exploded with influencer-endorsed ads. Supermodels lounged on yachts, crystal-clear waters sparkled behind them. And the message was clear: Fire was not just a music festival, it was a lifestyle. But what awaited festival goers was anything but luxury. When attendees arrived, they were met not by villas, but by FEMA disaster relief tents. The gourmet meals, white bread, slices of cheese, and a limp lettuce leaf, served in styrofoam containers. The artists never came. The infrastructure didn't exist, and there were no flights home. Billy McFarland had pulled off one of the most infamous scams in modern history. Behind the scenes, chaos reigned. McFarland had grossly overpromised and failed to deliver, despite advertising the event as sold out and elite. He hadn't secured the basic necessities to host it: water, food, sanitation, or even proper permits. Vendors went unpaid, contractors abandoned ship, and festival goers were stranded without answers. What had been marketed as a dream had spiraled into a PR and legal nightmare, and it was only the beginning. Case 10, the Fire Festival, a mirage of luxury and lies thousands of dollars, dreams of paradise, a promise of unmatched luxury and unforgettable music. But what ticket holders got was a nightmare. In 2017, what was supposed to be an exclusive music festival on the stunning beaches of Great Exuma in the Bahamas turned into one of the most notorious scams of the decade. Marketed as the ultimate luxury experience, complete with private villas, gourmet meals, and top-tier musical acts, the Fire Festival captured the imagination of young elites around the globe. Promoters Billy McFarland, a young entrepreneur, and rapper Ja Rule led the charge, selling not just an event, but a dream. Social media played a central role. Glossy ads featuring world-famous models and influencers lounging on white sand beaches flooded Instagram, building the illusion of a once-in-a-lifetime escape. Tickets were priced as high as $122,000, with VIP packages promising yacht parties, beachfront mansions, and direct access to celebrities. But behind the perfectly curated campaign was a disaster waiting to unfold. When festival goers began arriving, what awaited them was far from the paradise they'd been sold. Instead of lavish villas, guests were herded into FEMA disaster relief tents. The promised gourmet food was nothing more than bread, cheese, and lettuce served in styrofoam boxes. Basic necessities like security, transportation, and sanitation were non-existent. Stranded and confused, many realized they had walked into a trap, one fueled by lies, ego, and unchecked ambition. As chaos spread across the island, Billy McFarland continued to post misleading updates online, trying to maintain the illusion that everything was under control. But the truth couldn't be hidden for long. The internet erupted with videos, photos, and first-hand accounts of the failed event. It was a PR catastrophe of epic proportions. The backlash was immediate and overwhelming. Influencers who had helped promote the event were called out. Lawsuits flooded the courts. Victims, many of whom had spent their life savings on tickets and travel, demanded refunds and accountability. Vendors, contractors, and investors who had never been paid also joined the legal firestorm. In 2018, Billy McFarland was arrested and charged with wire fraud. Prosecutors revealed that he had knowingly deceived investors and customers, falsifying documents and exaggerating financial claims to secure millions of dollars in funding. He was sentenced to 6 years in federal prison, but the consequences went beyond prison time. The Fire Festival became a cultural symbol of deception and the dark power of influencer-driven marketing. It exposed how curated content could manipulate public perception and how trust in social media figures could be weaponized for profit. McFarland's downfall sparked widespread discussions about ethics in digital marketing, consumer protection, and the need for transparency in event promotion. In the wake of the disaster, the music and events industry took note. Organizers, promoters, and platforms began adopting stricter marketing regulations. Consumers became more skeptical of too good to be true offers, especially when promoted by celebrities with unclear motivations. Billy McFarland, once a rising star in the startup world, was now a cautionary tale. While some saw him as an ambitious entrepreneur, in over his head, others saw him for what the court ruled him to be, a fraudster who put ego and greed above honesty and accountability. Even after his conviction, McFarland maintained that he never intended to deceive anyone, a statement that rang hollow for the thousands he had hurt. For his victims, the damage was deeper than financial loss. Many spoke of humiliation, betrayal, and trauma. They weren't just scammed, they were publicly ridiculed. Yet, in the ruins of the Fire Festival, some found strength. Online communities formed where attendees could share their stories, laugh through the absurdity, and find comfort in shared experience. For many, surviving the Fire Festival became a badge of resilience. Angela Stevens, a fire ticket holder turned financial literacy advocate, began speaking publicly about the experience. She warned others to be wary of marketing hype, and taught audiences how to vet investments and offers. Like others, she had been drawn in by the illusion, but she emerged more vigilant, more empowered. The legacy of the Fire Festival is clear, a mirage sold through social media, powered by lies, and paid for by the unsuspecting. It stands as a stark reminder that in the digital age, illusions can be bought and sold, but the truth always comes due.